In lieu of opening remarks, I only want to say one thing, but in lieu of opening remarks, I thought a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I've given you 4 cartoons, which basically summarizes my take on the energy and environment nexus. I just want to say one other thing to sort of explain the difficulties this panel is going to have, for example, relative to panel 5. I've been reviewing the literature on gender differences, and I've learned of a number of research findings, and the chief among them is an MIT study that demonstrated clearly that group intelligence varies directly with the proportion of women in the group. And I only have Diana and Anne, so we'll do our best. So I'd like to remind you of the four conference questions. We were looking at what are the most important gaps in mandates and resources. We wanted to know about critical gaps in coordinating mechanisms. Particularly, are there early harvest recommendations for the G20 in Mexico? And what are the most promising areas for collaborative research amongst institutions and think tanks? We're going to do things a little bit differently this panel. We're going to go 3 minutes around the table each. We're going to use the Zedillo-Martin process of last night. After 3 minutes, the speaker's mic is going to be cut off. So they're going to limit their initial remarks to 3 minutes. And then we're going to go straight to the audience, because there's so many bright colleagues here that we'll get the conversation going amongst colleagues and questions, and we'll collect a bunch of comments and questions, and then we'll go back around the table again towards the end. And we've got a very entertaining and exciting presentation for you at lunch, so I don't want to go past 12:30. We'll try and really keep it short. So I'll ask people when we do go to the audience, please make your comments and questions as brief as you can. So I'd like to start with Jed. Jed, you've written about challenges short-term, medium-term, long-term. Do we have the proper governance framework to achieve these challenges?
That's easy, no. And in particular, we are particularly weak on taking longer-term challenges. In fact, my view is longer-term challenges are simply challenges that play out with long lead times, which require fundamental policy and decision-making now, which we just seem to, at times, push away from us as we get consumed with shorter-term issues. That's no different whether we're talking, I think, the private sector, whether we're talking government, whether we're talking the G20. And we have, I think, what makes this century unique. We have a set of issues which require fundamental transformation in the coming century, whether it's resource scarcity, biodiversity, other environmental issues, whether it's the structure and form of the energy system, and of course the challenges such as climate change. These require fundamental changes in the form and the way we do things, and we just are not up to doing that. And the international governance system, in my view, is extremely weak. I just want to say a few words about the global energy assessment, because it's a good example of the adhocracy that tends to develop when you don't have an institutional form that can address adequately problems. This is a group of some 300 researchers. It's a virtual network. It's got a secretariat based in Luxembourg near Vienna at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. It's 4 years in the making, and it is essentially a science-based, comprehensive review of energy sustainability. It's concerned with a wide range of issues from security, health and pollution, access, which is fundamental in many countries, as well as addressing climate change. With the predicate that any decision in any area to change the form and structure of energy infrastructure and use affects all of these areas. The critical finding of this work is the absolute centrality to bring co-benefit analysis into policy decision-making. It's not good enough to say we're solving a climate change issue or a national security issue. We are, in fact, trying to solve all of these at the same time. As we go through the discussion, I will draw on some of that work perhaps. It's not yet concluded. It will be published early next year. It's a large tome, as you can imagine, 300 researchers in 25 groups, and it's been through a fundamental peer review process, so that takes time. But in my remaining 15 seconds, energy demand and use is actually quite central. It is constrained by lifestyle choices, it's constrained by institutional factors. There are major market failures in implementing solutions. But if you could get energy efficiency right, you would certainly give enormous flexibility to the supply side solutions that we need to develop. Thank you.
Thank you. That was useful. Thanks for keeping to the limit. Anne, I should make a commercial here. Anne's editor of a great piece, Everything You Want to Know About Global Energy Governance. It's an LSE publication. Anne was editor of it. Just a wonderful current piece of information. And you've written a lot about the role of the IEA in International Energy Agency. What advice do you have for alerters about governance institutions in the energy field?
Thanks, Barry. I want to start by picking up on what Jed was saying about the easy answer to, do we have a good system of global energy governance, is no. I completely agree with that. We don't actually have a system of global energy governance. What we have is a chaotic, fragmented mishmash of institutions, rule systems, organizations, and more gaps than anything else when it comes to dealing with energy. But the International Energy Agency is a really good way of focusing in on what the problems are and what can be done. If you look at why the IEA was set up in the 1970s in the first place, it was with a very narrow definition of what do you have to govern internationally when it comes to energy. It was a response to the oil price shocks of the early 1970s, and it was an assumption that energy security is about making sure you have reliable and affordable access to supplies, and that includes putting some limit on supply shocks. So you got essentially a consumer's response. And the International Energy Agency has grown very greatly since then, but its core is still, it is the oil consumer nations who have come together under the auspices of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That in itself is a very big problem. It no longer includes among its membership a whole lot of the major oil consumers, notably China, India, Brazil, others, but particularly China. It's done a good job in terms of coordinating responses among these consumers to oil supply shocks, most recently this past summer with the Libya crisis. But this is very much too small a way to think about what it is that global energy governance needs to be addressing, needs to be dealing with. And the International Energy Agency has recognized that, and over the last several years has been trying to tie a lot of the bigger pieces together. And those bigger pieces are, if you want a system of energy services that actually meets the world's needs, you have to think about a bunch of things simultaneously. You have to think about development and essentially the physical basis of modern civilization. You have to think about security and geopolitics because there's competition for these resources. You have to think about the environmental spillovers of our current energy systems. And you have to think about what happens to national governance in countries that are suppliers, because it is so easy. We've all heard about the resource curse and what that does to systems of governance. You have to have a system of global energy governance that simultaneously tries to balance across all of those competing priorities. The IEA has tried to do things like develop roadmaps for both member and non-member countries about how do you have a path to a more sustainable energy future. It's had major outreach to the non-members, particularly China and India. It has a huge number of publications, scenarios. It's trying to fill a lot of the knowledge gap. But it's one little agency. The entire staff of the International Energy Agency is less than 250 people, and we don't have something else to fill in the gaps.
Thank you, Anne. Colin, you've called for a focal point and a forum for coordination in global energy before, pointing to the externalities that result from the various investments and policy decisions. What practical ideas would you suggest that could improve the current governance system
Thank you very much, Barry. I think the way I would like to put this in 3 minutes is to talk to you about a paradox of two no-brainers in the energy governance area. And the first no-brainer is that if you look, as Jed and Ann have both already well articulated, if you look at the energy field, there's no other field like it that requires such a massive transformation in the sources of supply, just to take that element of it. I mean, clearly we can't depend on fossil fuels to the extent that we have in the past, and therefore the wedges, the pie-shaped wedges of the global energy supply system needs to be transformed in a major way. How does this get done? Well, this is a classic case for coordination because it requires long-term investment, which is indivisible, can't be broken down into small bits, and takes on a long-run gestation period before the benefits start to be accrued. So market forces cannot give you the right incentives and price signals to lead to an optimal allocation over the long run that is both leads to economic growth, but also leads to environmental and social sustainability of the pattern. So what we have here is a classic case for coordination instead of relying on markets, but we have, as Jed and Ann have already pointed out, a void in the system in terms of what kind of institutional structure can actually provide this coordination. So that's one example. The second example of the sort of no-brainer is that if you look at this year, at Fukushima, and realize that because of it, all the nuclear energy issues that needed to be posed to the international community in terms of safety and regulatory reform are embedded in that particular crisis, much more so than Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island or any other crisis. But what has happened? On April 1st, President Sarkozy announced that in Japan that he would have the G20 take this up. It is the case that the agenda for Cannes does not have nuclear safety and regulatory reform on its agenda and won't have it, I'm afraid. The other is that the International Atomic Energy Association, the IAEA, has had a ministerial meeting in June and a general meeting in September, has fashioned an action plan for nuclear safety, which many of you will have in front of you, has been passed out. And my understanding is from Trevor Findlay, who is much more of an expert in this than I am, is that this has been passed by the AEA, but has not got the teeth that are needed. So you have these two examples where you either have a global challenge with no institutional framework to deal with it, or you have, in the nuclear case, an institutional framework that doesn't have the mandate to put teeth in the regulatory reform aspects of the action plan, which will actually make this work.
Thank you. We'll come back to that. Adil, in a video interview for ISD a couple of years ago, you suggested that global environmental governance is like herding cats, and if you want to herd cats, you have to be nice to them. And second, that the evolution of global environmental governance is in fact a good story, not a story of a system that failed, but a story of a system that simply has outgrown its design. So my question to you is, if global environmental governance needs a new design, given that there are fewer fat cats than there used to be, what should be the next steps in promoting this changes in the system? What advice do you have for Lourdes, for example?
Yeah. Thanks. I do think it's a mixed story, and especially in environmental governance. I've insisted that it's actually a good story, in the sense that we have actually expanded international environmental governance at an amazing rate by any measure, except for implementation. The money available, the institutions available, the time of talk available, everything has increased. Implementation is the only one. But let me respond to that by making a couple of small points. The first of which is actually related to the title of our discussion, and it relates to what you do with herding cats. When we talk of an unfinished house, and with the picture that there is, the assumption is that there are missing pieces. Everything else is okay. And there are missing pieces that we somehow have to find and put in. and then everything will be okay. I was originally trained as a civil engineer, and the little bit I know about sort of redesigning structures is that sometimes you actually have to think about what needs to be demolished before you start thinking about what needs to be added. And adding a new room very often requires breaking down a few walls. And I think that's very central to both environment and energy governance. I think it's a very important case with G7 and G20. We keep skirting that issue as if one will eventually disappear, and maybe it will. But that question of how you get to the finished house is an important one. On the issue of climate, which really is the defining environmental issues of our time, and is probably one of the defining governance issues of our time, I very vehemently think that it's time for a fundamental rethink about what climate governance means. Not because we got it wrong the first time, but we have waited so long that the climate problem has changed. We are no longer living only in the age of mitigation. We are now living firmly in the age of adaptation. And that means that some climate change is inevitable, probably happening as we speak, which means that some adaptation is happening, will happen, and therefore climate policy and climate governance becomes a very different thing. Last time I was in this room, I ranted, and let me rant again, that it's time to decarbonize the climate debate. We are obsessed with carbon. We have turned climate management into a carbon management problem. Carbon is central to climate management. It is not the only thing in climate management. In fact, I would argue you need to look elsewhere on the periodic table if you really want climate solutions. In particular, we've been talking about the green economy. The green economy really will come from a blue economy. Climate is now as much about water as it is about carbon. If you're thinking mitigation, you're thinking energy. If you're thinking energy, you're thinking carbon. Very good, yes, agreed. But as soon as you think adaptation, think about the impacts of climate. And these are now inevitable impacts. Most of them are about water. It's about water rising, sea level rise. It's about water disappearing, drought. It's about water melting, glaciers. It's about water falling from the sky like no one's business, droughts. So the point I'm saying is that as we look into climate, we need to reassess what governance means, and it means water.
Thank you, Barry.
I should say, David was supposed to chair this panel, but they thought they needed somebody who was more rude and uncultured. So David, if I can ask you one question. David Victor's characterized the UNFCCC and the Copenhagen Accord as, quote, legal zombies, that they're agreements that have no relation to what governments will actually implement, yet are hard to kill or ignore. So my question to you is, do you agree with this characterization of this gridlock on climate change negotiations, and what do you suggest for Plan B, and particularly what can Lourdes slip in?
Well, thanks very much, Barry. It's the first time I've ever been disqualified from anything because I was too polite or tactful. I was thinking through last night what this was and what advice I'd give to Lourdes, and part of the problem is that I think she and her government are going to end up running the G20 in the light of either two failures or two failures dressed up to look like successes. One is the Durban meeting of the UNFCCC, and the other one is the Rio +20 conference immediately precedes the G20 meeting. I don't think the prospects for either one of those are very good. We've now got to the stage in climate diplomacy where lack of failure is qualified as a success. So if you can stop everybody from running from the room and slamming the door, it's considered to be a real success. I don't think the answer to dealing with this is about energy, and energy is at the heart of the modern economy, so it's principally an economic issue. Climate change is partly an environmental issue, but it's principally an economic issue. And I don't think it'll get solved in the UNFCCC system all by itself, any more than you could take these economic issues and throw them in the UN system. There are too many countries, the negotiations are too difficult, you need a smaller group. President Bush's solution to this was the Major Economies Forum. The problem with it is that it's environment ministers, and the second problem with climate change is environment ministers aren't going to solve the problem because they have no real economic decision-making power. I think I probably have just about used up my time, but what I'll do, if I may, in the question period, is respond to what I think are some real opportunities provided by the current discussions about economic restructuring. I think you can do this in one way and you can do it in another way. And if you do it in the second way, there are things you would do about things like fiduciary responsibility and public reporting and measurement that would be more likely to promote more sustainable forms of development than if you did them in another way. So I think there are some dual solutions here that come as part of the discussions that Mr. Bhattacharya was talking about before. And if somebody asks me the right question, I'll be happy to talk about that a little bit. But this is really an economic issue. We have to provide a very large amount of capital for the transition to a low-carbon economy, and we're going to have to do that at a time when we have financial stringency all around. And one of the real opportunities is going to be dealing with fossil fuel subsidies. There are probably $500 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies afoot now. Governments are broke, will never get a better chance at subsidy reform again. As Paul Martin proved when he was the finance minister of Canada, the way to deal with subsidies is to take all the sacred cattle, herd them all into a pen, and shoot them all simultaneously. Because then you have 1,000 people each complaining and nobody hears them. If, in our case, if Mr. Flaherty is serious about getting rid of his $4 billion deficit, he could start with the $2 billion subsidies we now give to the impoverished fossil fuel industry in Canada, and the $1 billion we also give to impoverished farmers to turn food grains into motor fuel. And
David.
there's 3/4 of the deficit. So that's the
Thank you, David. Diana, anything to learn from the WTO?
Definitely not. No, definitely not. I mean, I think we all feel that the subjects that we study are disappointing, and maybe then we look for another issue, and this is the way it should work. The WTO is a global governance arrangement for trade. Well, it definitely is not. But let me say that I also want to thank the organizers for not including trade, omitting trade from the agenda. And maybe that's the reason why I'm sitting among environmental experts. But anyway, I think, and I've learned along the way, that the environment is very much a process issue. And so the question that I want to pose, and sort of inspired by the panel before us, is do we have for the environment the type of agency that we had for the London summit in Britain? So the question, of course, is can the environment move in a way that the crisis management moved in London? Now, having said that, I think that we have an opportunity in Mexico. And even though I belong to the pessimist camp, I think that the G20 has lost a lot of momentum. It is riddled with disagreement, and I think we need to instill some sense of purpose into the G20. I think at the same time that events will continue to drag on and will continue to drag on the G20 agenda, especially if countries grapple with the threat of the Great Depression. So this is my pessimist. But now going into the optimism, I think there is a window of opportunity for Mexico. I mean, Mexico has recently hosted the COP16 meeting in Cancun, and despite what David has just said about Durban and Rio, I think the heat will be on the environment, so to speak, and in a positive way, to do something about the environment. And what to do? I think the background paper is very enlightening in the terms of the gaps and, I mean, the undercommitment that we have on the environment. But I'm not sure that's the way to go. I mean, the quick fix for the environment. I think perhaps we have to look at things that we have learned from the G20 process that can be transferred to the environmental issue. And I've thought of two, even though there was pessimism around the table last night and today. And I think of two ideas, and of course open for debate. Is it possible to establish a review process to assess environmental management in the same way that the MAP process has done? I mean, the MAP process, President Cedillo, was a fiasco, and I agree it was not, I'm not sure it was a fiasco. Maybe it didn't live up to expectations. And maybe, again, I mean, can we do something for the environment along those ways? And the other process issue, before I end up with my 1 second left, is can we work with environmental management in the same way that we've worked with tax cooperation, singling out cooperative and non-cooperative jurisdictions? I think we have to pick up from the national reports to the Climate Change Convention, and we have to catalyze, sorry, the committee, stop, end, for the Green Climate Fund, see what we can do with that. Good, thank you.
You're very kind, thank you. Okay, what I propose to do, I have, in case this has been too soporific, I have a series of questions, but we're open for questions from the floor at this point. And then the plan would be that last 10 or 15 minutes before lunch, we'll come back to the table. So any comments or questions, but very, very brief, understanding the microphone rule if it goes on for more than a minute or so. Table 1.
Thank you. It's over here. Stuart Patrick, Council on Foreign Relations. I have a question about one of the complaints that's made in the overview document, which, with respect to not so much climate itself, which obviously has multiple different actors, but the general environmental field with 300 different agencies and incredible diffusion of authority and locations. I was wondering, the French in the past have mooted the possibility of a World Environmental Organization. That's never gotten very much traction. Is that even a likely prospect, or would it have adverse consequences to multilateral collaboration on environmental issues? Thank you.
I was rude to you. Do you want to give him a 10-second answer on that one?
No. I think the problem with it, and Otto and I have written on this extensively, so he can finish the answer. I think the essential problem with it is it then becomes an excuse. While they're busily creating this organization, it becomes an excuse for inaction for 4 or 5 years. The other problem is that it's very vigorously opposed by the United States, China, India, and Russia, which doesn't give it extremely good prospects for success. The second item on the agenda in Rio is the reform of international environmental governance. That'll be on the table, but that's not what's going to emerge. But Otto can give the rest of the answer, and that way we get twice as much time.
No, very briefly, so it's not a good idea. It never was, and therefore it will never die. It's been there from before UNEP was born, and every good politician, and some not very good ones, will keep resurrecting it. There are much better ways to achieve what you want to achieve. UNEP is a perfectly fine agency. Actually, I think it's a very good agency given the resources it is given by the countries. Some of the things that you can do to achieve it is cluster the environmental agreements. The problem is actually not with UNEP. I think the problem is with all these MEAs that have developed, and many of whom have actually larger budgets than UNEP itself. So you strengthen UNEP, you give UNEP all that you might want to give a GEO or a WEO, and more importantly, you cluster the agreements, all the water agreements together, all the atmosphere agreements together, and that's the logical way to do it. So you don't move towards a WTO, but you kind of, I've been writing for years about something called GUIDE, the General Agreement on Environment and Development, that essentially the first half of most of these agreements look very similar. The eventual architecture is you start clustering them. Some of that is already happening with chemicals. It's happening with the biodiversity agreements. I think it will inevitably happen with the atmosphere agreements. That's the way to go.
Table 5? We'll come back. Table 5.
Yes, thanks, Chairman. I have a question for Anne. And it arises from one of the difficulties with the current increased interest in nuclear energy by developing countries. They go to the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the agency lays out this huge list of things they need: infrastructure, safety and security, culture, finance. It's endless, and they get very disheartened. The problem is there's nowhere for them to go then to get the alternatives put before them. The IAEA can't do that, shouldn't do that. I've seen it being tempted to do that, to suggest alternatives, but essentially this leaves the developing country in midair. Okay, nuclear energy is not for us, but where do we go? So my question is, how would we or could we transform the International Energy Agency into a true international body? It's the OECD's baby right now. So how do we transform that into something that would serve everybody, including the developing countries, and include non-nuclear energy alternatives? Thanks.
That's very much exactly what the International Energy Agency wants the world's governments to want it to do. And it is trying to develop all these roadmaps, work with the non-member countries, but it's an organization of, I think it's 28 member countries right now. It's less than 250 staff. Had a zero real growth budget for the last decade or two. So it's a very small entity, but it still is trying to develop these kinds of roadmaps and these frameworks for advice. But look at the size of the agency compared to the size of the problem. If you look at, you want to give countries a sense of how they can proceed with the major energy transition that we all know we desperately need for the whole range of climate development, environmental purposes. IEA puts out figures saying that we need something like $26 trillion in new investment in energy from now to 2030 just to meet business as usual. That's to meet market demand. You want to make it climate sustainable by some reasonable definition. You need an extra $10 trillion of investment. Right now, the ways in which we get those investments channeled across borders they're largely private flows. There's very little effective regulation of the kinds of energy projects in which those flows are invested. The World Bank is trying to set up a series of criteria, but the emerging member countries of the World Bank don't want those criteria. They want rapid development of traditional energy sources. You have export credit agencies that are absolutely essential to supporting these kinds of cross-border flows of financing that goes into energy. They don't have environmental criteria or development criteria. They have business criteria. So right now, there's a huge number of points of leverage, something that the G20 could be looking at. What are the points of leverage where you can affect the kind of energy investment that is being made? Part of that there have to be the roadmaps that organizations like the IEA are trying to develop. There is certainly prospect for non-governmental actors also to have a role in the kind of energy assessment that Jed and others are involved with. But there's lots of different points of leverage. You can't expect the International Energy Agency to carry them all.
Let me move to Table 8, and we'll come back to Table 8.
Thanks, Barry. There are three interrelated challenges that at least we in the developing world face right now: infrastructure, agriculture, and climate. And the totality of the amount of financing required is of a scale that's very large. It's at one level very opportunistic, because if you think about that rate of investment, if you made it climate proof, the impact would be very large. If you did it badly, the impact would be very bad. The G20 is discussing sources of possible financing, including phasing out of subsidies, but it is a very contentious issue. So the question is, what do you think that Durban can do in terms of good or in terms of harm? And what do you think that we in the developing world ourselves can do in terms of giving some concrete momentum to the climate agenda?
Anybody want to take that? You go first. 1 minute, though.
I think you've got three things exactly right, which is why this is such a difficult question. I don't know what Mexico or Durban can do, but I do think that developing countries need to think about those three things together: infrastructure, agriculture, and climate. A lot of the infrastructure investment will come from developing countries themselves. Always has, always will. And therefore, they need to take that climate issue seriously themselves. But what does it mean for a developing country to take a climate issue seriously? It does not mean what it means for Canada or the US. And I come back to this issue of adaptation. In some ways, you need to think, if you're a developing country, you need to start thinking about adaptation and mitigation at the same time, especially as you make those infrastructure investments in energy.
But that wasn't the question. That wasn't the question. The question was, what can Durban do?
Not fail. I think Durban really can't really do much. I'll tell you what it will do. It will make a fund, and everyone will be happy to it because it's $100 billion, and then no one will put money into it, which is what's happened to every fund before that.
Yeah, part of the problem with the fund is, in response to Anne's challenge of finding all this capital, a very large chunk of it's going to have to come from the private sector. And yet very little of the discussion of the Green Climate Fund has involved discussions with anybody in the private sector. And the trick to this is going to have to be, how do we give the right incentives to private investors to invest in the kinds of low carbon strategies that'll be necessary to deal with the issue that Anne is talking about, these multi-trillions of dollars that are needed, and how do we stop it from going entirely into coal-fired power plants? And that's a whole set of incentives to private investors, and I think it's a different set of packages for public-private partnerships. And Kyle Koch-Weser, who's the chairman of Deutsche Bank, has been talking about that. How do you actually use public money to de-risk some of these very big investments in things like wind farms and solar farms in India and Africa, so that private investors can actually manage to put up the money and expect a reasonable rate of return? And I don't think that discussion will happen in Durban, but it needs to. We can't have another one of these funds in which governments talk over here and then somebody else talks over there, and the twain doesn't meet.
If I can, because
let me expand it, because I mean, there's too much emphasis on the energy sector when we talk about investment requirements. By the energy sector, I mean energy supply, midstream transmission. What's quite fundamental is the need to fundamentally change infrastructure in the building sectors, infrastructure in transportation, new public systems for moving people. If you look at where money is spent, we spend around, what, 13, 14 trillion a year in public and private investment. Current energy sector figure is around $1 trillion. If you start to add in money that is spent on energy-using equipment, which is in the automobile sector, which is in classic infrastructure, and I would include agriculture as well, we have a fundamentally different picture. So one of the issues for the UNFCCC, Durban may be too early, is to begin to shift the focus away from just emphasis on supply and midstream energy, large-scale projects. And that is a real challenge. And that is probably where the answers lie, with a whole set of other issues which generally don't get tabled.
I'll be very, very brief. And I do apologize for my cynicism, but each of the last 6 COPs of the UNFCCC, each of the last 6 COPs has created a fund, because it's the easiest thing to create, especially if you don't intend to put money into it. None of what you're saying, and you're exactly right, is going to happen through a fund, and none of what you're saying is going to happen through a fund. It's going to happen at the World Bank, it's going to happen through private investments, and therefore a different mechanism that simply a fund is needed.
And this is where I think both the G20 meetings and World Bank meetings, essentially you have to look for the points of leverage as to who controls the channeling of the flow of money. I completely agree, creating another fund does nothing, and you're quite right, it's not going to be funded. But you can look at the export credit agencies of those who are the source for these massive flows of information and set up systems of rules such that they have a mandate from their governments, because these are government agencies. They have a mandate from their governments that has a certain set of criteria that helps bring about this much larger scale transition that Jed is talking about. Because I completely agree with Jed, you don't solve the energy and environment issues by focusing on energy sources. You focus it on energy services.
I think Anne is right, but I think that there are ways in which we can use this agenda that Mr. Bhattacharya was setting out. Things like changing the way in which fiduciary responsibility is set out for banks and pension funds. This is Gordon Brown's thing. At the moment, they simply can't invest for the longer term, many of them. What you do about short-termism, because this is a longer-term agenda. What do you do about ratings agencies? Are there ways in which we can get ratings agencies to take account of the actual environmental sustainability of the country? And how do you get corporations to report on this? There's a whole package of things that are part of the financial reform discussion that if they went one way would be more likely to foster investment in more sustainable forms of development. If they go the other way, they may create financial stability, but they don't create environmental stability.
Yeah, I just pick up David's. The issue of fiduciary responsibility it's quite a complex issue, and particularly investment in low carbon, for a very good reason. There's a lot of uncertainty about whether governments will carry through with investments. There's a major set of issues about if you push too hard, you lock in the wrong technology. Not all technologies are equal. There's a good reason why it's tough to put in some of the new low carbon technologies. They're not mature enough, yet others are fully mature. So you need to be quite selective about that. And I would make a final point. We clearly here are focusing on G20 and international institutions, but a lot of this is about national governments and local private sectors. And the interesting question for me is what then should be the working relationship? What would be a fully functioning G20, fully functioning international governance system to deal with the issues we've raised, if in fact it recognized a world which is much more open, social media, NGO structures, private sector, fundamental role for the national governments in changing and transforming their own individual energy sectors, because each country within reason has a different endowment, a different set of aims, and to some extent might even have different choices on lifestyle.
Table 9.
Thank you, Gordon. Sorry, thank you, Barry. I have a few comments on this table. Nuclear safety, we do believe it's fundamental, but I don't think it's an issue of the G20 at the moment, unfortunately. So as much as Mexico believes in disarmament and nuclear proliferation and be careful about nuclear facilities, it's not the moment to put it in the table. Trade in the agenda, I do believe it's where we have our weakest spot. We continue saying the same thing about Doha and nothing is happening. So we have always said, or we have repeatedly said that there's no point of adding a paragraph on trade, but many countries insist, and they think that putting a paragraph on trade is going to create pressure on some countries, which it does not. It just makes the credibility of the G20 terrible. And Barry, you didn't give that much time to David, and I do want to really ask David some issues. Well, as I stated before, green growth is going to be an important issue on the Mexican agenda, and it's how can we put it all across the board and in specific areas. And maybe here we have enough experts on different parts of the agenda to make some suggestions that will be very useful for Mexico on how, for example, in the issue of the infrastructure group, infrastructure on the development group, well, infrastructure geared towards green growth or renewable energies, or if we're going to talk about job creation, well, how can we work towards the creation of green jobs? I know it might be something naive to think that those things that we couldn't do in the UNFCCC channel, we can do them here. But what I think is we can try to put them in a certain way where some more practical ways of dealing with climate change can be done, and also, I mean, be able to put it into the global recovery. Probably it's not the best moment, but maybe to put it down there so Mexico can work in that area. Thank you.
It just occurred to me that may well be something useful that the G20 could say about trade. And as we discussed earlier, the green growth agenda is in real trouble in Latin America. The regional meeting on Rio +20 was disrupted over that. And it turns out this is partly a Brazilian fear of trade retaliation. And it might well be that the G20 ought to say something about the relationship between green growth and trade protectionism, and maybe even the relationship between climate policies and trade protectionism. Now, this is a divisive and difficult issue, But if the G20 could say something positive and sensible about that, I think you'd find it might diffuse a certain amount of the frisson in developing countries about green growth being an excuse for border tax adjustments and for other kinds of trade measures against exports from countries which were deemed not to be engaging in green growth. And that might be something worth exploring. And then you can put the throwaway paragraph in about the Doha round, but at least they've got something new that might be a useful statement to send to the rest of the world about the relationship between trade and climate and trade and green growth.
Very briefly, Lourdes, I would also underscore what David had said earlier, which is the timing issue. At Rio +20, which will be in June, and will be a big show whether it produces anything or not, there'll be two and only two issues. One of them is the green economy, the other is institutions. It is most likely that the green economy will fall on its face there because of what David was talking about. So there's a timing issue where I do wonder whether you want to underscore the green economy bit a lot, because right before your show would have been another show that might have actually stopped on that. My own sense is there's a blue economy that also ought not to be missed.
Tabe, quick one.
I mean, one other issue which is sort of headline for next year is it's the year of sustainable energy for all. So the issue of access, which I know has got a lot of interest and momentum developing, may well be one of the issues that could be addressed. So how does the G20 see itself positioning, whether it's a fund or what have you, that can help to kickstart access for all? And in fact, I know in discussions there's talk of setting a target for universal access for all by 2030. That has a tag, it's got costs, and it seems to me to fit right into the agenda.
Sure.
Okay, well, thank you. I was just inspired by the question on trade protectionism, and I go back to my trade. I think it's true, I mean, that there is a fear that there will be some green protectionism, and that's why I'm less cynical about funds than you were. I mean, I don't know what happens to the funds once they're announced, and definitely we do need some funding, so I'm less cynical about funding. I think that is a positive incentive. And then back to Doha, I think we have to say, it's a good idea to say something about trade protectionism. I'm not sure it's a good idea to say something about Doha. I mean, I think that could be separated. And maybe what we have to say is something about subsidies. I mean, subsidies in energy, is that another way? Is that another face for protectionism? Or what type of subsidies should be allowed and what type of subsidies we don't want, etc. I think Doha is, I'm not sure Doha is dead or not, but I mean, at the moment, when you have a currency war, or the risk of a currency war, to think of trade protectionism as the way that Doha is framing it makes no sense to me.
I hope this is a Plan B question.
It's still green. No, thank you. Lawrence McDonald, Center for Global Development. I want to come back to the question of climate finance. It's now obvious that whatever official flows are available are going to be totally inadequate to the challenge. And at the same time, we have these huge amounts of capital in sovereign wealth funds and elsewhere. And I'm curious if there are ways that we could use the limited and inadequate official finance as seed money to set up something like a fund of funds approach. And my colleagues, David Wheeler and Darius Nasseri, have written a paper suggesting this, where it would be something a bit like what the IFC does, where these sub-funds would vet and identify projects and put in limited capital that would in turn attract private sector capital and thereby leverage up and crowd in additional finance for climate. Could that work?
While they think about that, let's do table 7.
I mean, one of the obvious questions, I don't run a sovereign fund, but I mean, one of the obvious questions is, fine, if I do that, what sort of returns do I get? So I think at one level, there's a question of what are the risks I'm taking on and what am I going to get for it? Whether you could craft this, maybe at some point, I mean, the point about a fund of funds is somehow to spread risk quite substantially, and I think you've got to look much more carefully at the detail. But the idea, if you could get the right set of projects in there. And you're going to come back to the same set of issues. If we're talking about fundamentally restructuring the subsidy system to encourage, let's say, renewables or other preferred options, will they be able to pay their way through the 10, 20 years that you're looking at? And so I don't know whether this works or not, but I don't think we avoid the fundamental question about what is the risk environment, the role of governments, the ability to provide continuity in this. And that seems to me to be a fundamental and critical issue going forward. And I would have thought that's exactly the sort of thing the G20 could discuss. It may be absolutely right, this is not the meeting for it. But ensuring some continuity and not sudden changes in movement. I could take the UK government as an example on solar, feed-in tariff issues. There's a whole set of issues where governments, when they have to pick a pocket, still go to the green sector. We need to move forward with a degree of continuity. And I think that would apply to the fund of funds indirectly.
Table 7.
One of the roles of the G20 is to send the right signals to the appropriate bodies. When the members disagree substantially among themselves, it's obviously a lot more difficult. But one of the things they can do, it seems to me, is come to an agreement on the questions that should be asked. Questions that, when being asked and being answered in debate, can sometimes lead to consensus. If you take a look at the financial area, I think this is true. You look at David Reynolds went through a list of financial questions, which I think disagreeing parties would agree are the issues, in fact, that they have to tackle. So my question is, there's a huge amount of disagreement on the areas that you've been talking about: water, climate change, trade, energy. And so my question really is, and it's really a follow-up to Lords' question, what Mexico, I think, requires in these areas are the 2 or 3 key questions that have to be answered. And the question is, if this panel, if we gave them a couple of days, could they come up with those 2 or 3 questions? I mean, there's been a wide discussion, but could you come up with the 2 or 3 questions that, in fact, Mexico really could use as the vehicle and to send the signals, at least for debate, to the membership?
Let's hold that for their concluding remarks, and I will ask them each to, in their last comment, suggest to alert us to 2 or 3 questions for discussion. Table 11.
Sorry to come in again, but I work on this topic, and I felt today as if I'm walking through a bit of a fog, but suddenly there have been a couple of rays of sunshine coming through on the exam question of what the G20 can do. Lourdes is one ray of sunshine, that you have to choose your moment to put your topic on the table. And Paul's given us another ray of sunshine, which is maybe you ask the right questions rather than give the right answers, so to speak, which is all kind of interesting because it says that the G20 doesn't discuss what's important, it discusses what's doable somehow. I mean, you know, what we can help with in this whole discussion is to think about the strategy of managing G20 processes. Last year, my paper for the Korean meeting was partly about why isn't climate change more visibly on the agenda in last year's G20. I ran a vote on my website. 75% of people said climate change ought to be on the agenda of the G20, and it wasn't really, except for a bit on finance, because the Koreans were really worried about people disagreeing with each other and the talks kind of failing. So here we are in 2011 with not very good prospects for Durban. I mean, let's take a practical case. Say we agreed, which I think most of us would, that we would like to see an international carbon price of $50 a ton. Some of you might not agree, but let's just suspend disbelief. Say that was what we wanted to do. What trajectory through a sequence of G20 meetings would get us there, and over what time period? And can we actually kind of strategize a question like that as a way of understanding what can and can't be done with the G20?
Professor Maxwell, you have stumped the panel. We'll put his answers to his question in your. Oh, you may.
So, I mean, first of all, I'm still embarrassed because I don't think I answered Amar's question, and so let me give it another shot by combining these 3, Simon's, Paul's, and Amar's question about infrastructure. I do worry about you know, when you talk about pricing and stuff, and I'm going to probably disagree with everyone here, a lot of the climate-related energy policy and in the end boils down to how can we increase the price of energy, of fossil fuel energy, whether it's through carbon tax, whether through its subsidy removal or whatever. Now, as you do that, and I think a country like Mexico should be very, very cognizant of this, you have to confront the most important word that Jed had used, which is access. Energy now and in the future is an access problem for the poor, as much as it's an emission problem for the rich. And let me just tell, I'll just take 60 seconds, Barry, but a personal story. Last time I was on this table a few months ago, I had come here from Boston. This time I've come from Pakistan because 2 months ago I moved back to Pakistan. Here's the interesting energy story. When they were pitching this new job to me, they said, come and you'll be able to do this and you'll help the country and it's a great blah, blah, blah. And by the way, you know, LUMS is a great university because we have energy 24 hours a day. I'd never been pitched a job like that. We'll give you electricity 24 hours a day. The second person who talked to me about it, again pitched it. By the way, LUMS is a great place because the light never goes away. My wife was talking to a friend of her before we were moving, and they said, you know, LUMS is really great because they have energy 24 hours a day. If you live in Pakistan, that becomes really, really important because everywhere else, 10 hours a day, you don't have energy. The point I'm making is energy access has been kind of lost by us environmentalists in particular because our instrument is price manipulation. And that price manipulation, by the way, one large bit of that story, I went to LUMS, it's a great university, first day found for the first time in 25 years, they're going to have a deficit budget. It's got nothing to do with tuition, it's got nothing to do with students, it's got to do with the fact that they have 24-hour energy, we generate our own. So energy access is a really, really important problem, and we need to think about it as we manipulate prices.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to, yes, I understand, I just wanted to focus on the institutional innovations aspect of this conversation because it seems to me that the substantive conversation, first of all, we have a mixed agenda here between environment and energy. And what that conversation, to me at least, reveals is some conflicts about what sort of institutional conclusions you would reach if you're focusing, first of all, or primarily on the environment versus focusing on energy. There's some differences here about whether or not there are real voids in either environmental or energy governance. I think we should return to that conversation and see before, in the next 20 minutes, if we can't shed some light on whether there's any initiatives that could be taken in either the energy or the environment area, which could, you know, be actionable by the global community. Thank you.
Table 10, please.
Thank you very much. My question is more to Adil Najam than to anybody else. I was delighted to hear him talk about the blue economy and that we were already into an adaptation mode. So I'd like to give him a little more time through this question, since he noted that water issues manifest themselves through infrastructure, agriculture, and climate. How would you try and get this on the G20 agenda? What would you imagine that the G20 could usefully do faced with what you're calling, you know, the blue issues are already with us. What would you like to do to focus the G20 on these?
Again, in terms of...
Let me stop you there. That's, like Mr. Martin's suggestion, a question for Lourdes, okay? Sure. There's no one left in the queue. We're almost on time. Okay, what I'd like to do is just go around the table for your concluding remarks. Can we go in reverse order? Or do you want to do? Well, we can go the same order we went. Jed, you'll go first. I just have one other question. Yeah. Oh.
Can I jump in?
Well, I'm just really confused because it says here in black and white that there's no one left in the queue. How can that be?
No, I just I just pressed it at the last moment.
Please. No, that's right. She had
I'm just really sorry, but it's really frustrating because every time I insist, Mexico's priority is not to have more issues on the agenda, to concentrate on the fundamentals. And it's not that we don't believe oceans or nuclear energy are not important. They're crucial, but the G20 is not the place to bring these issues. Unfortunately, maybe not at the moment, maybe farther ahead, but it's a contradiction that we're saying that the G20 is losing presence and is losing its capacity to make change, and at the same time we are making presentations in why don't we put this on the G20, why don't we put this in the G20? I mean, it's really not, at least for the Mexican presidency, very helpful. Thank you.
You were told not to put Doha on. I just have one question which I'd like you to consider in terms of your sum up, in addition to any suggestions for questions that Lourdes might ask, bearing in mind what you just said. Last month, Sokolow, famous author of the wedges approach to dealing with shortcomings, he suggested that there was a real problem, real failures by the advocates of forceful action on climate change. And he said that the basic problem was that we haven't confronted the fact that the news about climate change is not welcome. People don't want to hear it. Second, that today's climate science is really incomplete, and that there's a credibility problem with the scientists. And third, that every, quote, solution carries risks. And we really need a different approach to dealing with the public resistance to climate change. Freeman Dyson pointed out that the developments on shale gas don't help because it makes it look like there's no real problem with respect to fossil fuel for growth in the emerging countries. There's plenty of shale gas around. So how do we change the approach to deal with public resistance? So we can just go around the table, a couple minutes each, if we can do it in 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Jed.
Let me comment on Rob's comments and then try and add some thoughts with respect to Paul's. Look, first of all, Rob's view is very much a US view. I have never liked the wedges because they simplify what is a very complex set of decision-making. So bits of each wedge, actually, when you look at national policy, bits of each wedge fit in, make sense, economic, politically durable, and so on. So I have a very clear view on the issue of how we address climate change. And I'll go back to Schwarzenegger in California. He gave a very interesting talk in Vienna when he was going back home mid-year. You want to sell climate change, it's extremely difficult in Salzburg because people don't worry about water rising. If you're in California, people are concerned with national security issues, they're concerned with the pocketbook, they're concerned with other issues. You've got to be politically astute. I think the work, certainly of global energy assessment, indicates you can go quite a long way to addressing mitigation by going straight in many countries for issues that are around national security, reduced energy costs, and so on. This has to be crafted locally, and it's not as simple, Simon, I think, as saying, let's look, we can certainly look at $50 as we've done, $100 carbon prices, but we've got to look at also the dysfunctionality in part of trading systems, how we set them, and we have many other energy policies to address this issue than just the carbon price, as important as it is. In terms of Paul, next year, I think access is an important issue. I think the window is right. It may be wrong for the G20, but there ought to be a very strong push, given that this is important for some of the UN agencies, to address the question of ensuring modern energy forms can come to the 2 billion or so who don't have them. I think there's a second issue which we shouldn't forget because it comes back and hits us on the back of the head from time to time. It's simply oil and energy pricing. We have been slow, and particularly in the context of the recent recession, in getting the investments in place. You could say in some peculiar way, what's positive is that demand levels have dropped somewhat. But the idea that we may well be facing rapid energy shock, price increases, price volatility in energy, needs to be looked at, and we need to look at the options for safeguarding that. The third point really is I would like to see, and it's probably not for the G20, but it's really understanding this point about looking at co-benefits in the widest sense. Health, pollution reduction, security, cost reduction, as well as climate change. So I stop there.
A couple of points. First, just picking up on Jed's point, energy price volatility is a huge threat to the global economy, and it is something that the G7, G8 engaged with whenever prices went up and forgot about when they went down. Let's hope the G20 doesn't follow the same pattern and realizes that the price of energy is a major, major factor in the G20's ability to help bring about any kind of global economic stability. Second point is probably going to sound naive, but I think it is one that needs to be taken seriously. All of the work that the G20 is doing about issues of banking regulation, sovereign wealth funds, financial flows, financial stability, is all being done as though the planet doesn't matter, which makes no sense whatsoever. How you regulate the global financial sector is treated as though it's a separate question from what does the money end up doing? What does it support? What does it finance? At the same time that we know that we have to have a massive transition in the kind of infrastructure we have, the kind of energy systems we have, the kind of transportation systems we have, yet no discussion is happening about what are the norms, what are the guidelines that ought to be in place, agreed among the world's major economies as to how that money gets used in the long run. It's very nice if you have a banking regulatory system that prevents your banks from collapsing. Obviously, that's essential. But to lose the opportunity to tie that to the questions about fundamental sustainability, I think is a real lost opportunity.
Thank you. I think the whole issue that you raised here at the end, Barry, about public resistance to climate change clearly extends far beyond that. I mean, in a way, the Wall Street movement is one in which people around the world, ordinary people, are coming out and saying they've had enough with what politicians and policymakers have brought them, which is a financially driven world economy which subjects their lives to shocks and insecurities, losses of wealth, and losses of jobs, and in some cases, losses of housing, shelter. Pretty basic stuff. So we're in a very different point now than we've ever been in the history of the G20 summit level since 2008. It's a much worse political situation. The low level of trust in leaders is clear from every poll that you want to take. Even now, I think you could say, with the way that parliaments in Europe have been dealing with the Greek crisis, there's a question now about whether or not democracies can really manage their economies within a globalized economy, because parliamentarians don't seem to understand how to take long-run trajectory issues. So it seems a moment in which we cannot think boldly in terms of institutional innovations in energy and the environment, or anywhere else for that matter. But we've just got to go with what we've got, which means that it gives more space for people, researchers, academics, think tank people, intellectuals, people with ideas to come up and try to influence the political and institutional context that we're given. But I'm concluding from this discussion rather pessimistically that we basically don't have a moment in which the public will support innovations, in which governments will adopt them, and in which they can actually work. Thank you.
Well, I agree with what Anne was saying, and I think it's quite important. I think, Lourdes, the answer is it's clear that the G20 ought to stick to its knitting, which is really economics and economic reform. And how do you deal with these issues within that agenda? Now, you raised the green growth question, and the green growth question, I think, is critical. And to the extent that it gets aired and discussed, it will actually bring up some of the issues that Odell, for example, has raised. But it'll bring it up much more in a growth context. I'd love to see the G20 resume its momentum about getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, they got going on it, and then it kind of frittered away. Governments have no money. If we're ever going to get rid of subsidies, now's a very good time to do it. And then, as I say, I think that to the extent that one begins to discuss the kinds of things that Anne was discussing and that Paul was raising, There are ways in which you can restructure the banking systems and the investment systems in such a way that they're more likely to promote more sustainable forms of development. So they become win-win discussions, and you get an outcome which won't solve the problem, but it won't make it any worse. And we're only going to get a limited number of chances at fundamental financial reform. And I think if we can get a recognition that it's reform for something other than just stability, it's stability plus, and it's stability plus whatever you want to call it, green growth, low carbon economy, energy transition, whatever. But just so that we begin to send the right sort of signals to investors and to other participants in the financial system, that this makes a lot of sense in terms of the longer term environmental future of the planet. I agree with Colin. I don't think now's the time for sort of massive institutional experimentation, but you will have the flotsam and the jetsam left over from Rio to cope with, whatever Rio manages to do with this international environmental reform agenda. I don't think it'll be very much. That'll bob up to the surface as well.
Thanks. In response to Paul Martin's question, I don't know if Mexico is the right window for it, or Durban is the right window, or Rio is the right window, but I do know that at some point soon, I hope that world leaders will change or expand the climate question to start focusing seriously on impacts. That's the one word, impacts. If they start thinking seriously about the impact of climate change, what climate change is and will do to people, that will automatically lead to thinking about adaptation, and that will automatically lead to thinking about issues like water. You don't need to start with water to end at water. That will automatically start thinking about infrastructure, about agriculture. That's the way to go. If we also start thinking about the impacts of policy, not just what climate change will do, but what our current path of climate policy will do, what will be the impact of that, that will automatically make us think about access. Because what we have essentially been doing is saying, let's somehow increase the price of energy. And what you are seeing, again, with the demographic stuff I was talking about before, you will have a very large number of people in what will be the growing economies who will either not have enough energy or will just bypass that international regulation. And adaptation is really an ugly thing. Adaptation is essentially the process where people are forced to act in ways they would not rationally otherwise act. That is how people adapt to climate. That is how they will adapt to policy. So my one word would be impact.
Well, thank you. I very much sympathize with Lourdes' question and the way she was concerned about the agenda. I think it's right. I mean, I like the way that Mexico is looking at the agenda, narrowing it down, looking at what's doable. And I also think it's very good to look at the process of the G20. I mean, to see what the delivery has been and what it is useful for. Now, I think at the same time that the G20 needs some sense of purpose, and perhaps green growth may not give it a sense of purpose because the G20 is a crisis management committee, but at the same time, I think it's an opportunity to definancialize the agenda, which is where the public rage at the moment is. I mean, it's seen to be, I mean, sort of this over concentration on finance, on bonuses, etc., is definitely unpopular for the very right reasons. So perhaps, I mean, green growth should be on the agenda for Mexico with some minute areas, well, I wouldn't call them minute, but some process areas that have to be left for 2013 and 2014, like what will happen after the WTO ministerial. I mean, and I think I'll go back to subsidies. I think that's a proposal that Deborah Steger put in the packet to revisit the subsidies agreement and look at the subsidies agreement in the context of green growth. That's all for now.
I'm really reluctant to sum up. Let me just say one thing in terms of advice to Lourdes, aside from the suggestions to stay away from a carbon price, stay away from a World Environment Organization, and don't mention Doha. The other main positive contribution that you can make is to basically establish the research agenda for the next couple of years that does not involve any discussion at the meeting by leaders, but just to ensure that in the statements and communiques that come out, that you provide terms of reference or remits to groups of organizations or groups of ministers or groups of officials to come back with the answers to some future questions at future summits. And you can catalyze and energize a great deal of research activity on some substantive questions without having them discussed at the table. So you have that great privilege. Other than that, I just ask you to thank our panelists for what I think was a useful discussion. In lieu of opening remarks, I only want to say one thing, but in lieu of opening remarks, I thought a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I've given you 4 cartoons, which basically summarizes my take on the energy and environment nexus. I just want to say one other thing to sort of explain the difficulties this panel is going to have, for example, relative to panel 5. I've been reviewing the literature on gender differences, and I've learned of a number of research findings, and the chief among them is an MIT study that demonstrated clearly that group intelligence varies directly with the proportion of women in the group. And I only have Diana and Anne, so we'll do our best. So I'd like to remind you of the 4 conference questions. We were looking at what are the most important gaps in mandates and resources. We wanted to know about critical gaps in coordinating mechanisms. Particularly, are there early harvest recommendations for the G20 in Mexico? And what are the most promising areas for collaborative research amongst institutions and think tanks? We're going to do things a little bit differently this panel. We're going to go 3 minutes around the table each. We're going to use the Zedillo-Martin process of last night. After 3 minutes, the speaker's mic is going to be cut off. So they're going to limit their initial remarks to 3 minutes. And then we're going to go straight to the audience, because there's so many bright colleagues here that we'll get the conversation going amongst colleagues and questions, and we'll collect a bunch of comments and questions, and then we'll go back around the table again towards the end. And
it is so easy. We've all heard about the resource curse and what that does to systems of governance. You have to have a system of global energy governance that simultaneously tries to balance across all of those competing priorities. The IEA has tried to do things like develop roadmaps for both member and non-member countries about how do you have a path to a more sustainable energy future. It's had major outreach to the non-members, particularly China and India. It has a huge number of publications, scenarios. It's trying to fill a lot of the knowledge gap. But it's one little agency. The entire staff of the International Energy Agency is less than 250 people, and we don't have something else to fill in the gaps.
Thank you, Anne. Colin, you've called for a focal point and a forum for coordination in global energy before, pointing to the externalities that result from the various investments and policy decisions. What practical ideas would you suggest that could improve the current governance system?
Thank you very much, Barry. I think the way I would like to put this in 3 minutes is to talk to you about a paradox of 2 no-brainers in the energy governance area. And the first no-brainer is that if you look, as Jed and Anne have both already well articulated, if you look at the energy field, there's no other field like it that requires such a massive transformation in the sources of supply, just to take that element of it. I mean, clearly we can't depend on fossil fuels to the extent that we have in the past, and therefore the wedges, the pie-shaped wedges of the global energy supply system needs to be transformed in a major way. how does this get done? Well, this is a classic case for coordination because it requires long-term investment, which is indivisible, can't be broken down into small bits, and it takes on a long-run gestation period before the benefits start to be accrued. So,
from security, health and pollution, access, which is fundamental in many countries, as well as addressing climate change. With the predicate that any decision in any area to change the form and structure of energy infrastructure and use affects all of these areas. The critical finding of this work is the absolute centrality to bring co-benefit analysis into policy decision-making. It's not good enough to say we're solving a climate change issue or a national security issue. We are, in fact, trying to solve all of these at the same time. As we go through the discussion, I will draw on some of that work, perhaps. It's not yet concluded. It will be published early next year. It's a large tome, as you can imagine, 300 researchers in 25 groups, and it's been through a fundamental peer review process, so that takes time. But in my remaining 15 seconds, energy demand and use is actually quite central. It is constrained by lifestyle choices, it's constrained by institutional factors. There are major market failures in implementing solutions. But if you could get energy efficiency right, you would certainly give enormous flexibility to the supply side solutions that we need to develop. Thank you.
Thank you. That was useful. Thanks for keeping to the limit. Anne, I should make a commercial here. Anne's editor of a great piece, Everything You Want to Know About Global Energy Governance. It's an LSE publication. Anne was editor of it. Just a wonderful current piece of information. And you've written a lot about the role of the IEA in International Energy Agency. What advice do you have for alerters about governance institutions in the energy field?
Thanks, Barry. I want to start by picking up on what Jed was saying about the easy answer to do we have a good system of global energy governance is no. I completely agree with that.
We've got a very entertaining and exciting presentation for you at lunch, so I don't want to go past 12:30. We'll try and really keep it short. So I'll ask people when we do go to the audience, please make your comments and questions as brief as you can. So I'd like to start with Jed. Jed, you've written about challenges short-term, medium-term, long-term. Do we have the proper governance framework to achieve these challenges?
That's easy, no. And in particular, we are particularly weak on taking longer-term challenges. In fact, my view is longer-term challenges are simply challenges that play out with long lead times, which require fundamental policy and decision-making now, which we just seem to, at times, push away from us as we get consumed with shorter-term issues. That's no different whether we're talking, I think, the private sector, whether we're talking government, whether we're talking the G20. And we have, I think, what makes this century unique. We have a set of issues which require fundamental transformation in the coming century, whether it's resource scarcity, biodiversity, other environmental issues, whether it's the structure and form of the energy system, and of course the challenges such as climate change. These require fundamental changes in the form and the way we do things, and we just are not up to doing that. And the international governance system, in my view, is extremely weak. I just want to say a few words about the global energy assessment, because it's a good example of the adhocracy that tends to develop when you don't have an institutional form that can address adequately problems. This is a group of some 300 researchers. It's a virtual network. It's got a secretariat based in Luxembourg near Vienna at the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis. It's 4 years in the making, and it is essentially a science-based comprehensive review of energy sustainability. It's concerned with a wide range of issues
We don't actually have a system of global energy governance. What we have is a chaotic, fragmented mishmash of institutions, rule systems, organizations, and more gaps than anything else when it comes to dealing with energy. But the International Energy Agency is a really good way of focusing in on what the problems are and what can be done. If you look at why the IEA was set up in the 1970s in the first place, it was with a very narrow definition of what do you have to govern internationally when it comes to energy. It was a response to the oil price shocks of the early 1970s, and it was an assumption that energy security is about making sure you have reliable and affordable access to supplies, and that includes putting some limit on supply shocks. So you got essentially a consumer's response. And the International Energy Agency has grown very greatly since then, but its core is still, it is the oil consumer nations who have come together under the auspices of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That in itself is a very big problem. It no longer includes among its membership a whole lot of the major oil consumers, notably China, India, Brazil, others, but particularly China. It's done a good job in terms of coordinating responses among these consumers to oil supply shocks, most recently this past summer with the Libya crisis. But this is very much too small a way to think about what it is that global energy governance needs to be addressing, needs to be dealing with. And the International Energy Agency has recognized that, and over the last several years has been trying to tie a lot of the bigger pieces together. And those bigger pieces are, if you want a system of energy services that actually meets the world's needs, you have to think about a bunch of things simultaneously. You have to think about development and essentially the physical basis of modern civilization. You have to think about security and geopolitics because there's competition for these resources. You have to think about the environmental spillovers of our current energy systems. And you have to think about what happens to national governance in countries that are suppliers, because